Static crackled over the weather radio at 2:30 a.m., a faint warning barely audible over the hum of generators. Across coastal Louisiana, residents stirred, some dismissing the alert as another routine tropical watch. But meteorologists at the National Weather Service had been tracking a massive hurricane for days. By February 9, 1979, Hurricane Frederic, already a Category 3 storm in the Gulf of Mexico, was predicted to make landfall near the Mississippi-Alabama coastline. Forecast models showed storm surges capable of flooding entire low-lying towns, yet local officials hesitated. Evacuation orders were delayed, warnings filtered inconsistently, and communication channels fractured under bureaucratic friction. The storm wasn't a surprise. Satellite imagery, wind measurements, and tide predictions all pointed to extreme danger. Oil platforms in the Gulf were evacuating crews, schools were preparing to close, and radio stations relayed repeated advisories. Yet in the hours before landfall, many residents of Mobile, Alabama, and surrounding parishes were left with vague guidance. Investigations later revealed a series of missed cues. The state had outdated emergency protocols, parish-level disaster plans were uneven, and interagency communication relied on teletype and patchwork radio networks. Warnings that should have triggered mass evacuation remained buried in reports, sometimes received only hours before the storm made landfall. Residents who trusted official channels found themselves confused by conflicting statements. One bulletin cited high winds and flooding, another reassured that only minor damage was expected. On the ground, first responders braced for flooding and high winds, but they lacked clear directives on where to stage rescue operations. Emergency shelters were unprepared for the sudden influx, and many citizens didn't know which routes to take when roads became blocked by rising water. The hurricane's path turned every delay into a risk multiplier. Bridges were overtopped, power lines downed, and neighborhoods with inadequate levee protection faced the first brunt of the surge. This disaster wasn't the result of a single failure, but a cascade of warning system breakdowns. In real time, the danger was apparent to meteorologists and federal forecasters. But at the state and local level, hesitation, conflicting interpretations, and limited communication tools meant that what should have been a coordinated evacuation became piecemeal and delayed. Every hour lost amplified the impact, leaving communities exposed to winds exceeding 130 miles per hour and surges reaching over 10 feet in some areas. Frederic's landfall became a case study in how warnings fail, not because the signals aren't there, but because the systems intended to act on them are fragmented. Early tide gauges and storm track models predicted inundation zones accurately, yet those projections were not effectively translated into public directives. The National Hurricane Center's forecasts, though technically precise, collided with local officials' caution and a lack of standardized evacuation thresholds. Citizens who might have left earlier remained, unsure whether the risk warranted abandoning homes and businesses. As the hurricane slammed ashore, the consequences of delayed action were immediate. Coastal towns experienced widespread flooding. Thousands of structures sustained roof and siding damage. Hundreds were stranded in rapidly rising water. Post-disaster reports highlighted that many communities had received initial warnings as much as 36 hours before landfall. By the time official evacuation orders were issued, the storm was already a matter of hours. For some, that time window was too short. Frederic forced a reckoning with the mechanisms of risk communication in America. Meteorologists, emergency managers, and government officials began to study not only the accuracy of forecasts, but the clarity, timing, and delivery of warnings. It became apparent that technical precision alone could not save lives. The messaging had to penetrate bureaucracy, reach local authorities quickly, and motivate immediate action. In the weeks after Hurricane Frederic, investigators mapped the timeline hour by hour, comparing forecasts with evacuation orders. The pattern was striking. Warnings had been issued early and repeatedly, but the decision-making chain at the parish and city level slowed everything to a crawl. Some mayors waited for the official state directive. Emergency coordinators argued over road closures, shelter capacities, and the risks of disrupting commerce. By the time mandatory evacuations were declared, many residents had little time to act, particularly in low-income neighborhoods where transportation options were limited. Federal and state agencies documented glaring gaps in communication. Weather radio alerts reached only a fraction of the population. Teletype and telephone networks were inconsistent. Local broadcasters sometimes edited bulletins, softening the urgency to avoid panic. Citizens relying on multiple information sources received conflicting messages. Without a clear, authoritative voice, indecision spread faster than the storm itself. The storm surge struck with brutal efficiency. Communities that had hesitated were inundated, and roads intended as evacuation routes became barriers. Rescue teams scrambled, often arriving hours after water had trapped residents. Hospitals and shelters were overwhelmed, revealing that logistical planning had lagged behind forecasting capability. In the aftermath, Frederic became more than a hurricane. It became a blueprint for understanding why warnings fail. Reforms followed, emphasizing not just forecast accuracy, but the speed and clarity of communication. Emergency management agencies standardized evacuation protocols, implemented redundant radio and telephone networks, and developed public messaging strategies that emphasized action over ambiguity. Hurricane preparedness education programs expanded, teaching citizens how to respond to specific warning levels rather than interpret vague advisories. The storm also reshaped the relationship between federal and local authorities. Previously, the National Hurricane Center's role ended with issuing forecasts. After Frederic, collaboration became essential. Forecasts had to be actionable. Local leaders had to be empowered to declare evacuations swiftly. Communication channels had to be reliable and redundant. The lessons extended beyond Alabama, influencing hurricane preparedness along the entire Gulf Coast and Atlantic seaboard. Frederic proved a stark truth. Advanced warning systems are only as effective as the human and institutional structures that act on them. Accurate forecasts mean little if they are delayed, misinterpreted, or ignored. The hurricane highlighted the delicate balance between scientific prediction, administrative decision-making, and public response. It triggered reforms that would save countless lives in storms yet to come. Years later, the legacy of Hurricane Frederic was visible in the very architecture of American emergency management. The storm revealed that accurate meteorology alone could not prevent disaster. The weak link was always in the chain of communication and action. States began codifying clear evacuation thresholds tied directly to storm categories and predicted surge levels. Local governments upgraded emergency operations centers with dedicated radio networks, backup generators, and pre-mapped evacuation routes. Public alert systems, once inconsistent, were standardized to ensure that citizens received clear instructions in real time. Perhaps most importantly, Frederic reshaped public expectations. Communities learned to treat hurricane warnings with urgency, understanding that hesitating for confirmation could be fatal. Emergency drills, coordinated messaging, and interagency exercises became routine, embedding the lessons of delay and miscommunication into the very culture of preparedness. By confronting the human and institutional failures that had amplified the hurricane's impact, Frederic transformed how America responds to storms. Forecasts would no longer speak into a void, and warnings would finally carry the weight of action. The static crackle of a weather radio, once ignored, had become a call to be heeded. It symbolized the system-wide vigilance that the disaster demanded and the reforms it forged. The changes set in motion after Frederic didn't happen overnight, but by the late 1980s, their effects were tangible. Coastal communities along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts now had layered warning systems, sirens, radio broadcasts, televised alerts, and eventually automated phone and digital notifications. Evacuation zones were clearly mapped and rehearsed annually. Emergency managers learned to anticipate the human element, the hesitation, the disbelief, the logistical hurdles. They designed messages that prompted action rather than confusion. Hurricane preparedness became a science that blended meteorology with psychology, logistics, and public policy. Every subsequent storm benefited from Frederic's hard lessons. Evacuations became faster, shelters better stocked, and communication more reliable. Residents no longer waited for the perfect confirmation. They acted on official guidance. What had once been a tragedy born of delayed warnings transformed into a model for disaster response nationwide. The storm had taught a brutal but enduring lesson. Forecasts are only the first step. Life-saving action depends on clear, timely, and trusted communication. The crackle of that early warning had changed how an entire nation listens when disaster approaches. Decades later, emergency management in the United States looked nothing like it had in 1979. Hurricane Frederic had forced a fundamental rethink. Forecasting alone wasn't enough. States invested in redundant communication networks, ensuring that warnings could reach every community without delay. Evacuation plans were no longer suggestions. They became enforceable protocols with clearly marked routes and designated shelters. Public education campaigns taught citizens how to interpret hurricane watches versus warnings. Frederic's imprint extended beyond infrastructure. It reshaped the culture of preparedness, embedding a mindset that warnings demand response. Emergency drills, interagency coordination, and rapid decision-making became central to disaster planning. Forecasts now came with a built-in expectation that humans, institutions, and technology would act in concert to translate knowledge into survival. What began as a storm that overwhelmed a coastline became the catalyst for a nationwide system where warnings no longer fail silently. The static of those early weather radios now symbolized vigilance, the lesson that the difference between safety and disaster is often measured in whether people hear, understand, and act in time. By the early 1990s, the reforms Frederic had exposed were fully integrated into coastal emergency management. Nationally, the National Hurricane Center worked closely with FEMA, state emergency offices, and local authorities to ensure that forecasts were not only accurate but actionable. Standardized evacuation zones, automated alert systems, and multi-channel communication strategies meant that residents received consistent instructions. Drills and simulations became routine, testing both infrastructure and human response. The storm's legacy also influenced public behavior. Communities no longer treated hurricane warnings as optional advisories. Residents stocked emergency supplies, planned escape routes in advance, and trusted official guidance rather than waiting for multiple confirmations. Disaster preparedness became part of civic responsibility, a lesson written into culture as well as law. Frederic had proven a simple but profound truth. Early warnings are meaningless unless systems and people act on them. The static that once crackled over radios before the storm had become a clarion call for reform. Static crackled across the weather radios, sirens wailed in the distance, and emergency bulletins flickered onto television screens. In the pre-dawn hours, coastal Louisiana was stirring uneasily, but many residents still didn't grasp the magnitude of the storm headed their way. Hurricane Frederic, a Category 3 hurricane by February 9, 1979, had been intensifying for days over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Forecast models were clear. Storm surges would inundate low-lying communities. Wind speeds would exceed 130 miles per hour. Oil rigs were evacuating crews, schools were closing, and radio stations repeatedly issued advisories. But at the local level, the warnings were tangled in bureaucracy, miscommunication, and hesitation. The hurricane was not a surprise to scientists, yet when it approached land, a gap between knowledge and action became fatal. Residents of Mobile, Alabama, and surrounding parishes were receiving conflicting information. Some bulletins emphasized minor damage, others hinted at life-threatening flooding. Local officials debated the timing of evacuation orders, reluctant to disrupt lives and commerce unless absolutely necessary. By the time mandatory orders were issued, many had only hours to respond. Roads, bridges, and levees that were widened to provide safe passage quickly became barriers under rising waters. Those who had heeded the warnings faced gridlock and overcrowded shelters. Those who hesitated faced the storm directly. Investigations after the hurricane painted a detailed picture of institutional failure. The state's disaster protocols were outdated, with emergency planning uneven across parishes. Communication relied on patchwork teletype and radio systems, and information was often delayed or misinterpreted. Federal meteorologists had produced accurate forecasts, yet the channels to translate those forecasts into immediate, actionable guidance were fragmented. Local authorities, unsure of whether to act on partial information, slowed evacuation decisions. Even when warnings reached residents, they were diluted by inconsistent reporting and a lack of standardized messaging. The chain of warning was intact in theory, but broken in practice, leaving communities dangerously exposed. On the ground, first responders braced for impact with inadequate guidance. Emergency operations centers lacked clear directives on where to stage personnel or how to prioritize rescues. Shelters were ill-prepared for the sudden surge of evacuees. Citizens were left improvising evacuation routes, often contending with flooded streets, downed power lines, and blocked bridges. The storm surge arrived with unrelenting force, overwhelming neighborhoods that had hesitated to evacuate and turning last-minute departures into life-threatening situations. Hundreds of homes were submerged, vehicles swept away, and emergency crews struggled to reach those trapped by the rising waters. The hurricane exposed the human and institutional weaknesses that often lie beneath the surface of technological forecasting. Accurate meteorology alone could not save lives. Predictions of wind speeds, tide levels, and rainfall intensity were meaningless if they were not coupled with fast, clear, and authoritative action. Every hour of delay magnified risk, and every miscommunicated advisory increased exposure. Frederic became a cautionary tale in real time. A technically predictable disaster became catastrophic because the system intended to act on that knowledge faltered. In response, reforms focused on the entire ecosystem of warnings and action. Emergency management agencies at the federal, state, and local levels began designing communication protocols that prioritized speed and clarity. Evacuation orders were standardized with precise criteria tied to storm category, surge predictions, and projected rainfall. Multiple communication channels, including sirens, radio, television, and later automated alerts, ensured redundancy. Communities were mapped into zones with clearly marked evacuation routes, and shelters were prepped with supplies and staffing plans tailored to projected populations. Education became another central pillar of reform. Public outreach programs taught citizens how to interpret hurricane watches versus warnings, emphasizing that action should be immediate. Drills became routine, reinforcing what to do when a warning sounded rather than leaving individuals to interpret the threat themselves. These programs bridged the gap between scientific knowledge and human response, a critical step that Frederic had revealed was missing. Forecasts alone could not compel action. Citizens needed clear, actionable instructions they trusted and understood. Interagency coordination was strengthened as well. Before Frederic, the National Hurricane Center produced forecasts, but responsibility for evacuation decisions fell to local officials, often with insufficient information or resources. After the storm, federal, state, and local agencies established protocols for sharing real-time data, pre-positioning resources, and coordinating messaging. Forecasts became actionable, integrated into operational plans rather than ending at a weather map or a bulletin. Decision-making authority was clarified, and local leaders were trained to act decisively when warnings indicated imminent danger. Hurricane Frederic's lessons also reached into engineering and urban planning. The storm underscored the vulnerability of infrastructure in the absence of timely human action. Roads, bridges, and levees had to be evaluated not just for their structural integrity, but for their capacity to function under emergency conditions. Evacuation planning was incorporated into urban development, ensuring that high-risk neighborhoods had multiple egress routes and reliable access to shelters. The human element, timely action, compliance with guidance, and trust in the system was now recognized as inseparable from physical preparedness. In the decades following Frederic, the reforms born of its failures dramatically reduced casualties in subsequent hurricanes. Storm surge maps became precise, evacuation zones were clearly defined, and emergency alerts reached millions simultaneously. Citizens internalized the lesson that warnings were not optional, and emergency managers internalized the lesson that technical accuracy without timely action is insufficient. The storm had revealed a fundamental truth. Predictive science is only part of the equation. Saving lives requires systems, policies, and communication networks designed to turn forecasts into rapid, coordinated human action. The crackle of static on that early morning weather radio, once easy to ignore, became emblematic of a system-wide transformation. Frederic had shown that delays, miscommunication, and indecision amplify the power of natural hazards. The hurricane catalyzed reforms in forecasting interpretation, evacuation planning, public education, and interagency coordination, creating a culture of preparedness that endures today. It proved that disasters are not only measured in wind speeds or flood levels, but in how effectively warnings are conveyed, trusted, and acted upon. In the end, Frederic did more than devastate a coastline. It reshaped the very way the United States approaches disaster warning and response. The storm highlighted the vulnerabilities in both human behavior and institutional structures, and the reforms that followed became a model for protecting lives long before the next hurricane made landfall. What was once background static on a weather radio transformed into a lifeline, ensuring that future warnings would be heard, understood, and acted upon with urgency. By the 1990s, the lessons of Hurricane Frederic had been fully absorbed into the architecture of American disaster preparedness. Evacuation orders were no longer optional suggestions. They were structured, enforceable, and communicated through multiple redundant channels. Coastal communities had layered alert systems, sirens, radio, television, and eventually automated phone and digital notifications. Evacuation zones were clearly mapped, routes rehearsed annually, and shelters stocked and staffed based on detailed population projections. Perhaps most importantly, Frederic reshaped the culture of preparedness. Citizens learned that hesitating could be fatal. Trust in official guidance became a key part of survival. Emergency drills and interagency coordination became routine, embedding the lessons of delayed warnings into both policy and public behavior. Meteorology, logistics, and psychology merged into a new science of human-centered disaster management, ensuring that warnings were not just accurate but actionable. Frederic's legacy endures every hurricane season. Forecasts now come with clear instructions, evacuation orders are timely, and communities understand the cost of delay. The crackle of a weather radio, once background noise in the pre-dawn hours, transformed into a lifeline. The storm taught a simple but profound lesson. Warnings fail not because the storm is unpredictable, but because communication, decision-making, and human action must work in perfect sync. By confronting the systemic failures that amplified its impact, Frederic ensured that the United States would never again treat disaster warnings as optional, turning early alerts into lives saved, not opportunities lost.